Welcome everyone to the first indoor meeting of the Garden Club this year. Our first meeting was off-site up in Granby, and we had a great time up there and great turnout tonight, so thanks to everyone for coming. I'm going to turn things over very quickly, but first want to welcome guests who are here tonight with us, so thanks for being here. Sure. So our co-president Patty suggests that all of our guests stand up if you would. So if you would be willing to do that, then we can all just say hello. And I'm going to turn it over to our co-vice president, Maureen Bacchini, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. And I'm going to pass out some flyers, but there are not quite enough to go around, so you might need to share with your neighbor. Or if you are a pair of people, please share.
Thank you, Deb. Where's our speaker?
I'm right here.
I lost her for a second, Karen. Okay, welcome everyone. Karen Bussolini is our first official speaker of this calendar year. She's a widely published garden photographer, speaker, writer. NOFA, that's
Northeast Organic Farmers Association.
Northeast Organic Farming Association. She's an accredited organic land care professional and eco-friendly garden coach. A gardener as long as she can remember, Karen trained as a painter and had her career as an architectural photographer before turning her attention entirely to gardening. Her work explores the many ways gardens connects us to our place on earth and to each other. Karen is a member of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Association of Garden Communicators, the New England Wildflower Society, and the Kent Land Trust. And after the meeting, she will accept some questions and answers, and she also has some books for sale that are right up here on the table to the left of the screen. So welcome, Karen, and I'm going to hand the speaker over to her.
Thanks very much for having me tonight. I'm pleased to be your speaker, but even more pleased that I'm your official speaker. So, wow. Before I get rolling with my talk, I'd like to tell you about what I've been up to, which is I have a monthly email newsletter called Eco-Friendly News, Views, Clues, and How-Tos. And if you would like to sign up for it, this is how you do it. I'll pass this around. And I see that I gave a talk in Wisconsin last week and my pen leaked, so I don't have a pen on it here. So maybe somebody could donate a pen. And if you would like to receive it, you must write legibly. I can't tell the difference between a 0 and an O or a lowercase l and a 1. So if you can make that clear, I think you'll enjoy it. So why don't I just start passing it around, and here we go. Could I get you to donate? We'll pick it up at the end.
I'll make a donation.
Okay, thanks very much.
You had two coming your way, in case one doesn't work.
Okay, follow the sign-up sheet then. Did everybody get a handout? If you'd like to know what the plants are that I'm talking about, there is a handout. So I'd like to share my journey of understanding and a lifetime of wonder and learning about nature and about native plants. I'm going to give you some big picture ways to think about it and some specific small things you can do to make a difference in your own yard. So I grew up in the Connecticut woods. I grew up roaming mountains and climbing trees and daydreaming on mossy ledges. And my mother taught me the wildflowers as she learned from her mother. And I always remember her telling me stories about going up on the mountain in Collinsville where she grew up and picking trailing arbutus. I have never in my lifetime seen trailing arbutus in the wild. We skied on that mountain and I've never seen anything, but common sights of my childhood were bluebirds learning to fly between the clothesline and the badminton net. Now, thanks to some of the berries I plant, I have bluebirds, but I've only had an indigo bunting twice and scarlet tanagers never. They were once common. I still remember being called to the big picture window in our house to see the most rare and amazingly wondrous of creatures, a deer. Right now I can't get them to run away even if I run out screaming at them. And we spent a lot of time just kind of swimming through tall grass and never knew about ticks. They weren't there. So my father kept a big organic vegetable garden. I loved helping him out with them. And I was a very busy little girl. All summer long, I'd go out into the woods and I would dig up all kinds of trilliums and rare wildflowers and plant them in my rock garden. And I pulled out all the plants that were growing there and dug in cow manure just like Dad did in the garden and tilled it and plant all of these wildflowers in there. And I couldn't understand why everything died. No matter how much I fertilized and watered, everything died. But now I understand what a destructive little kid I was. That I was taking plants that were perfectly well adapted to right where they were, removing plants that were adapted to the dry shade where they were, and over-fertilizing, over-watering. By digging the plants in the wild, I made a hole in a community of plants. And that was a disturbance, which of course is how you acquire invasive plants. You make a hole in an intact community. But I kept doing it because I learned at an early age that's how you garden. So imagine the scale of depredations, much larger than anything I could do when bulldozer pushed in the road up the street from us, and complex self-sustaining communities of plants and animals and insects were turned into a monoculture of lawn and exotic plants. It didn't feed anything. So I'm still a very busy girl, but I've learned to be less destructive. And this is a very exciting time when scientists and gardeners and landscape people are talking to each other and trying to landscape and garden in a more sustainable way, looking at the model of nature where nobody fertilizes or waters the forest. So can we learn to make landscapes like that? So native plants are totally key. Let's see what's next here. Okay, my two heroes. Native plants are not just what we call wildflowers. They're trees, they're grasses, they're shrubs. And they're grown in communities in a habitat where they co-evolve with bugs and birds and animals and a whole soil food web. So it's a very complex web. And if you haven't read these two books, Sarah Stein's book, Noah's Garden, and Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, they've rocked the world. They're really changing the way people are looking at everything. And Sarah Stein has explored the disconnect between what horticulture tells you to do and what ecology tells you to do. That nature is diverse. And what she said is America's clean, spare landscaping and gardening tradition has devastated rural ecology. The relentless spread of suburbia's neat yards and gardens that has caused local extinctions, entire communities of plants and insects. The well-stocked pantry of our native countryside have been wiped bare. And, we think we're doing good. We don't know the damage we do sometimes. So here's one little example. I live near Bulls Bridge in Kent, Connecticut. And there was a steep embankment near this river where there's always mist in the air, there's humidity, there's limestone, there's all kinds of rare plants there. And there was the whole roadside where it was very steep and rocky was trilliums. And the highway department came and cut down the trees. And by the next year, all the trilliums were gone because the shade was gone, nothing was holding the soil, so the soil was eroding. It completely changed the conditions that they were growing in. So trilliums are one of those quintessential wildflowers that loves that needs and loves moist, rich woodlands. They take about 7 years to bloom. And they're interested because their seeds have these little fatty bodies that the ants like to eat. And what the ants do is, this is how, if you want trilliums, they take about 7 years to bloom. First, you have to have ants, and they take the seeds, and they eat those fatty bodies, and then they throw the seed away in their garbage bin inside their, their ant colonies. And then they sprout in that nice, rich ant trash pile. So they're germinated with ant fertilizer. If you destroy an ant colony while, say, you're building a terrace or deciding you don't want ants in your yard, or every time you see an ant you get out to raid, then you are interfering with how trilliums reproduce. So, or if you clean up the woods, no more trilliums. So the big picture thing that I've really taken to be guidance is an ecological principle called the principle of self-organization. And this is a principle that goes through every biological system, where if it's your body, your yard, an entire ecosystem, an economy, a political system, from a simple start, say one cell splits into 2 cells, systems grow more complex and the members become more specialized and more tightly integrated over time. And the more complexity in a system, the more resilient, stable, and efficient with energy it is. So, can we think about gardening like that? That diversity and complexity makes for stable ecosystems. And here's an example of how it works. I love this. This is on the Beach Forest Trail in Provincetown, one of my favorite places. And what you need in order to have a stable, complex ecosystem is physical stability, which means reduced disturbance. So if you're rototilling every year, you're destroying the structure of the soil. You don't have that stability for a long-term community. Increased physical structures, so rocks, logs, stone walls, whatever physical structures we have in a yard is going to help with, excuse me, with a self-sustaining system. And reduction of exclusionary competition, which I think we can all see a lot of exclusionary competition happening with bittersweet and burning bush and other invasive plants. So the sand dunes are a really unstable environment, right? So the wind is always blowing, there's low diversity in it, and as soon as you get a pocket, so in this little dip, maybe a little soil collects, and then there's enough soil and enough water collecting so that a pine tree seed gets in there, and there's enough nourishment in the soil for the pine to germinate and to grow and to thrive, and it finds water underground that's collected there. And as soon as there's that structure, it's offering a different, little bit of shelter, so maybe the grass seeds that blow in can germinate, so you start to have more complexity and more stability. You start to have a lot of diversity. So here's what we do in our suburban neighborhoods. We simplify. And so this is a good equation to remember. That simplicity equals low stability. And a complex system is going to be stable. A simple one, such as one that's just lawn, means high maintenance. You have to keep putting things in to keep it going because it's not self-sustaining. And here's what I did on that yard. I made something much more complex. I planted plants that wanted to be there, that grew in layers, that could just basically take care of themselves. So that's something we can all do as homeowners, to think about reducing simplicity. So Doug Tallamy is the second person I talked about. And he's an entomologist who has studied the relationship between insects and birds. And he's communicated just beautifully in his book, Bringing Nature Home, about how organisms that have evolved together work out complex interactions. So many of us love watching birds and butterflies, and it's a really great portal to understanding this. And he talks about gardening for insect diversity, because insects are the basis of everything that we're looking at. If we want birds, they need insects to eat. Our plants have co-evolved with insects. They've developed chemical defenses so insects won't eat them, and then insects have developed ways of getting around that and digesting them. And what Talamy's research has shown is that 96% of American songbirds eat insects. So we think of birds as eating berries and seeds, but the babies need the protein of insects, mostly caterpillars and spiders. He talks about caterpillars being like a large amount of high protein in a very digestible wrapper. And so if those songbirds need insects, 90% of our insects can only eat specific plants, the ones that they co-evolved with. So if that plant isn't there, they can't eat something else, they just die. So when our landscapes are full of exotic, pest-free plants, that means nothing can eat them, and if the insects aren't there to eat them, then the birds aren't there. So no bugs equals no birds. So this is Cornus clusa, the Chinese dogwood, which is a beautiful tree that we see in many landscapes. And he says that they support absolutely no Lepidoptera, no moth or butterfly larvae can eat this tree.
Does anybody eat those berries?
Does anybody eat those berries was the question. I do. They're delicious. They have a really obnoxious texture. It's sort of like sucking on a football and big seeds inside, but if you squish them open and suck out the pulp and spit them out, they're too big for our songbirds to eat. So you see these great big little Sputnik fruits, some of them are an inch big. They're too big for songbirds to eat. Raccoons will sometimes eat them. Deer will sometimes eat them. But most often you see the black and shriveled up ones hanging on the tree from the year before. However, our native flowering dogwoods, and this is a wild one in the woods on my back slope, support more than 100 species of moths and butterfly larvae.
Karen, is that the American dogwood?
That's the American flowering dogwood, yep, so that's a wild one in my woods. And here's what the berries look like. And they're ripe now, and they're red now. And that red is advertising to migrating birds. And it's saying, hey, pay attention to me. I have just the nutrients you need to fuel your migration. So they're full of fats and lipids and just the kind of food that will either sustain migration, give them the energy, or sustain birds, excuse me, I'm froggy. Help them survive the cold and survive through the winter for those birds that stay with us.
I have a question.
Yes?
This year, my dogwood is just prolific with disease. Is this due to the climate or a cycle?
Okay, so her dogwood is prolific with disease?
Seeds.
Oh, with seeds? Oh, that's great. So it could very well be that we had a lot of rain just at the time that the berries were forming. Things go through cycles, like with apples, you'll have a really good apple year, and then the next year the plant kind of has to recover. So it goes in cycles. And these are really, really, really good bird food. But there are all kinds of dogwoods. This is gray dogwood, Cornus racemosa. And you can see that the berries are white, but the pedicels holding up the berries are red. So that's advertising to migrating birds. Here's the good stuff. This is the pagoda dogwood, another native dogwood that's an understory shrub. And it has blueberries a little earlier than now. They're all stripped pretty much clean now, but you can see those red little stems on the berries again. And then we have the red twig dogwoods. So we want to feed insects, but certainly we want to provide seeds for the birds. And these are all native plants from now on, except for the invasives I'll show you. So we definitely want to plant seeds. This is northern sea oats. And I have found that the seeds are big and the little songbirds don't really seem to eat them. And I love this plant. It's just a beautiful, graceful plant. I've also found that because nothing's really eating them, maybe some pheasants or grouse or larger birds, I think every seed that drops to the ground germinates. So you have to really love this plant if you want it. But you'll see here the kind of twirly maroon colored foliage. That switchgrass, that's a panicum, and has little teeny tiny seeds that are just what the birds need to eat throughout the winter. And if we want to feed hummingbirds, for instance, and other pollinators, people say, oh, I'm going to plant cardinal flower for the hummingbirds, right? Do you plant cardinal flower? Well, that doesn't bloom until July, so what are they supposed to eat between when they arrive and July? And this is one of my absolute treasures. This is Phlox stolonifera, which is a low creeping woodland phlox. And the very day this plant blooms, the hummingbirds come in May, the exact day it opens. So we need to think about planting throughout the whole season. This is chokeberry, another one of my favorites. Aronia arbustifolia brilliantissima is the cultivar name, and you'll see why it's called that in the next slide. So this is my office door looking out at this shrub. So it's providing pollen and nectar for early emerging bees. And then berries in the winter. And they don't call it chokeberry for nothing. It is really astringent. And what happens is these berries stay on all winter. So instead of the birds stripping them in November, and then you're looking at gray sticks for, 8 months of the year? Or maybe winter is 10 months, sometimes it seems that way. They freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw. And in March, when the bluebirds return, it's palatable and available for them to eat. So I just love looking out my office door and seeing this magical sight of a flock of bluebirds in these red berries, and I get to enjoy looking out at them all winter long. So everybody likes butterflies, right? But nobody wants caterpillars. Guess what? You don't get butterflies if you don't feed caterpillars. And that's why native plants are so important. Yep, that's a monarch, right? And a lot of plants that we don't really think of, when we think of butterflies, we think of the ones that they get nectar from. But of course, those caterpillars are their larval form, and they need to eat leaves. Things like native sedges, these grass-like plants, you wouldn't really think of that as a butterfly plant, but there are a lot of species that need particular grasses, like little blue stem, to eat. And speaking of those relationships, this is our eastern native lupin, Lupinus perennis. And it's the host plant for an endangered butterfly called the Carner blue butterfly. So, this is an example of that kind of relationship. You go to Maine and you see lupins all over the place. What they are is they're escaped Pacific Northwestern lupins, and they're a trap. What happens is the Carner blue butterfly lays its eggs in them, and they hatch. They lay their eggs there because their host is the lupin, and that's all they can eat. However, the caterpillars can only eat the eastern lupin, and when they hatch on the western one, they die because they can't eat it. So another example of why we might not know all of the relationships, but it's so important to plant native plants. So what can we as homeowners do? Number one, lay off the chemicals. We don't want to be killing insects. The last time I heard Doug Tallamy speak, he showed a slide once in the 20s, I think it was. They had a National Kill Insects Day, and now we need to think about growing insects, not killing them. And stop tilling unnecessarily. If you can avoid tilling, you will keep carbon in the soil rather than letting it release as carbon dioxide. And we want to cover the ground with living mulch with a diversity of native plants that form a real community. So we can't fix everything, but we can certainly knit together the land and the habitats in our own yard. So just as we don't get birds without insects, we don't get seeds, fruits, vegetables, or berries without pollinators. And so to support all of those insects, we want to have plant diversity to get insect diversity. So that slide was Panthema muticum, the mountain mint, which is just buzzing with bees always. Bumblebees, many of which are in real danger, are buzz pollinators. And plants like blueberries, cranberries, tomatoes are very hard to pollinate, and honeybees are lousy at it. Bumblebees get in there, and the pollen is really stuck up there and it's sticky, and they get in there and they can disengage their flight muscles from their wings, and they get in there and they vibrate, and that shakes the pollen loose, and they're hairy, so it covers them with pollen, and that's how blueberries get pollinated. So the more kinds of plants we have, the more we support native bees and other pollinators. This is Physostegia virginiana. They call it false dragon head. They call it obedient plant. It's not obedient at all. It's aggressive, and that is something I really value in the right place. It blooms in my garden for almost 2 months. It attracts every kind of insect and pollinator you could possibly imagine. It is a really, really great plant. For a long time, I held its being pink against it, but now I don't even mind that it's pink. Because the more insects you attract also, the more those insects include parasitoids and predators that do pest patrol for you. So if your garden is just buzzing with insects, chances are some of them are picking off your cabbage worms, or laying eggs in aphids, or scooping up aphids. So this is another mountain mint. This is narrow-leaf mountain mint, and the botanical and common names of these are all on your handout. This grows in drier places. So the question I always ask, I see no reason why plants can't be beautiful, solve problems, and support wildlife. And so I'm more and more asking, who is this plant feeding? Well, this is bloodroot, and it has elaiosomes on it, just like the trillium does, those little fatty bodies on the seeds that the ants take and bring to their burrows where they germinate. And I love this adaptation. You can see that, if it rains, this is an ephemeral wildflower. They bloom for, 2 days maybe. So they kind of close up, and the leaves shelter around them like a cloak, so that if it rains, the pollen's not going to wash away. They need insects to get at the pollen. And when the sun comes out, they open, and when a cloud goes over the sun, they just close right up again. And then, of course, people, love the fancy double cultivar, but the thing about double flowers is they're sterile. And if a plant is sterile, why would it put energy into making pollen or nectar to attract insects? Because it's sterile, it doesn't reproduce. So this bloodroot is not feeding anybody, as showy and pretty as it is. And we see an awful lot of really overbred hydrangeas, some of which are native, excuse me, some of which are not. And what we're looking at, we think of these as being the petals. Those are sterile flowers. So the big showy flowers are sterile. And there are a few, see a few seeds up there? So there are a few little teeny tiny fertile flowers, sometimes on the inside, sometimes hardly any. People get all, there's a lot of controversy about cultivars, what are called nativars, so cultivars of native plants. And any cultivar, so like every delicious apple is genetically identical to every other delicious apple. And the same with named cultivars of plants. They're vegetatively propagated. So we're not getting a lot of genetic diversity, but that doesn't mean they don't feed anybody. This is a native-var of a native azalea called Rainbow, and the butterflies love it. It's totally covered with butterflies all the time. So there are trade-offs. Often we don't know what they are. But this is Phlox giana, and when a scientific study was done measuring the nectar and the sucrose quantity and quality of a whole range of phloxes at Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, they found that this particular cultivar was better for pollinators than even the straight species. So it's hard to take a hard line one way or the other about these things. The research is still being done. So double flowers are sterile. If they're really congested, they're either sterile or it's just so hard for an insect to get in that they can't get to the nectar. So I was in a friend's garden on Cape Cod, and I was getting on my high horse, looking at this, fancy frou-frou echinacea, right? Purple cone flowers have come a long way. I thought, oh, look at that, congested petals on that plant, and I don't see any bees. I see bees everywhere but on this plant. And so I asked my friend about it, and she said, oh yeah, it was covered with bees, but it's already been pollinated, so there's no more nectar. It's been pollinated. It doesn't need to keep producing it. So these are not congested petals. Those are a gazillion nectaries, that each of which provided nectar. So I think a lot of this just requires close observation, and we can do that in our own yards. So another place that we sometimes get steered wrong is with nurseries, with dioecious plants. If you buy a holly, they tell you, whatever female holly produces the berries, you need to have a male consort to pollinate it, because male flowers are on one plant and female flowers are on another. So you might do that with winterberry hollies, but this is Ilex glabra, the inkberry, which is an evergreen native holly, and you see everywhere Ilex glabra compacta. It's a female clone. So they have lots of berries on them at the nursery because there are lots of males around the nursery. And if you don't buy the male cultivar that blooms at the same time as this plant, you won't get more berries. So these are just little facts of life that we need to know. So one of the very, very best, top quality, long blooming, lots of nectar for bees and pollen is Monarda, the bee balms. Monarda fistulosa is the best plant you can plant for bees. But we need to provide food over time, from the earliest to the latest. One of the other really top bee plants is goldenrod, and I had a little bit of goldenrod on my back slope, and now we have a little more than I planned on. But we have some really nice goldenrod cultivars that won't take over the world. And so those plants not only provide nectar for, we have I think 11 bee specialists that can only eat goldenrod, that only feed on goldenrod in the state. So goldenrod and echinaceas, you can see that something ate some of the seeds and something else is overwintering inside it. So to leave those things up. So we need to provide food from the earliest to the latest. Pussy willows are one of the earliest, and willows are one of the top plants for supporting wildlife, insects and birds. And even my wholesaler didn't know that there are males and females. They're dioecious. You need both if you're going to get seeds. But what's really important is the males. And even with the hollies, we think, oh, well, how few males can we get away with planting to have lots and lots of females with berries? But our early emerging native bees need pollen, and only the males have pollen. So both males and females have nectar, but only the males have pollen. So pussy willows, the males and the females look just the same until they open. And then the males have little dots of yellow pollen on them, so that's how you tell. So when you go to the nursery, shop early, or you could do what I did, which is I found some just growing by the side of the road, and they were covered with yellow pollen. And I stuck them in a jar of water, and they all rooted, and now I can plant them. So here's what a male pussy willow looks like. And I had been to a bee symposium, and they said that even mosquitoes are pollinators. And you know what it's like in March, the wind was whipping around. It finally stood still long enough for me to get this shot, and look, a mosquito landed right on it. So there's early season things like shadblows, and then feed them late. So, we have lots of flowers in the summer, but the really, really, early and winter blooming things and the late blooming things are very important. This is Heuchera villosa autumn bride, which is blooming now. Very showy. Asters are incredibly important. And then things like exfoliating bark. I always think, why on earth would you spend money and carbon importing butterfly houses from China when you could have a shagbark hickory or a paperbark birch, and insects will lay their eggs in there, they'll hide in there to overwinter, and then that provides bird food for them because all winter long the chickadees and the nuthatches are in there foraging. And another really important thing you could do that has a positive effect on wildlife is if you have a meadow, don't cut it down to neaten things up now. Wait till spring, because you have all kinds of insects overwintering inside stems and eating the seeds and taking cover in all of this. Those goldenrod galls, the chickadees will peck them open in the winter and eat the grubs inside. And if you can cut a field like this down to maybe a foot in the spring, then we have a lot of bees that are tunnel nesters that will nest inside the pithy stems. They can't get in there all by themselves, they need you to break the stems. So the previous year's stems provide egg-laying places. So it's really great if we can do this on a large scale. When you have all of these composite flowers like echinaceas and black-eyed Susans, that feeds a lot of bees. Bees are, they feed on one flower at a time. So they'll be just hitting all the echinaceas, not going from one thing to another, because, doesn't that make sense? You don't want an echinacea pollinating a delphinium. What good does that do? That's wasted pollen. And so they have landing platforms in the petals, and those centers are targets that can see them far away. So it helps them feed sustainably if you can do a big planting of something, plant in mass. And the other way to have a big effect is plant trees. They're big. They live for a long time. So that, that's a reliable source of shelter and food. So even, a sugar maple creates microhabitats and niches. They've got aphids in the summer that the birds are eating. They've got overwintering insects in the bark, and so the nuthatches will be working the trunk, and the chickadees will be working the branches. Red maples are even better because they're they kicked out. Red maples that we see in the swamp, the ones that turn red first in the season, are insect pollinated, so they provide a huge amount of food very early in the season when our earliest native bees hatch. Okay, so, we kind of have to deal with invasives. This is the apple orchard that I used to look out my dining room window at. So deer and lack of maintenance are rather major problems. They used to look up when they heard me, but they don't even look up at me even when I'm screaming at them and banging a tea kettle.
Santa's reindeer.
And here's what it looks like now, because my neighbors never mowed and never cut any invasives. And all the apple trees have broken under the bittersweet, and there's ailanthus with multiflora rose 60 feet in the air. because it's not been tended. So this is devastating our ecology. And the thing about invasive plants is they're not just garden thugs, they're not just aggressive. They, by definition, displace the native plant communities that should be there. And people are absolutely amazed at what shows up when they remove invasives and put a deer fence up so that the deer aren't eating every blessed thing. And here's what happens if you pull things and throw them over the stone wall. So somebody in my neighborhood was pulling Pachysandra and tossed it over the wall, and now there's like 1.5 acres of Pachysandra there. So if you're pulling invasives, bag them up and send them to the landfill, or bury them in one place. I have one pile that I just keep piling things up, and nothing will ever see the light of day again. And things like Japanese stilt grass, maybe people didn't catch on to that so fast because it's kind of pretty, but the deer won't eat it, and any native plant that dares stick its head up above it, or that survives the toxins it sends out, is going to get munched by deer. Garlic mustard, anybody have garlic mustard here? Garlic mustard pesto is delicious. And so what we try to do is find the Achilles heel of it, and I'll show you how that works in a little while. So we just want to identify these things. They're another trap plant, actually, so there are several butterflies that will lay eggs on them because they need mustard family plants, but then the caterpillars that hatch can't eat them, so they die. Bittersweet, I'm sure you've seen a little bit of this, and this is Virginia creeper. So, you know, the bittersweet girdles trees, right? And it climbs up and it goes over the leaves so they can't photosynthesize, and then it gets so heavy that the trees break when you get a snowstorm. This is our native Virginia creeper. It's got blue berries, but look, it turns red in the fall because it has really nutritious berries that are just what the birds need to sustain migration. And you can see that it grows up the trunk, and it just kind of trails along the branches and trails off. It doesn't girdle, it doesn't smother. It's a really good plant. It looks just like poison ivy, except it has 5 leaves instead of 3. And poison ivy actually is even more valuable as a bird food. So this is the time of year you can see where those sneaky invasives get in. I swear, bittersweet, when it's growing in lilacs, it looks like lilacs. When it's growing in spice bush, the leaves look like spice bushes. It's really sneaky, but yeah, one of the ways that invasive plants get the upper hand is that they photosynthesize longer than our natives. So when all of the leaves of our native trees and shrubs have dropped, and you see that bright yellow foliage, there's bittersweet that snuck into that viburnum. And somebody had a burning bush hedge, and now there's like 6 acres of it. You can see all that red stuff in the understory. And it's just green in the summer, and it's what scientists call plant blindness, right? It's just green stuff. Green is good, but all green is not good. Or barberry. If you have barberry, you will get Lyme disease. It's a long story, but there is a very close relationship between what we call deer ticks. They don't need deer, they need the white-footed mouse, and the white-footed mouse nests in barberry, where it's protected and it has humidity. And if you can get rid of barberry, you will vastly reduce the number of ticks. And if you can keep deer out also, you will really, really reduce your chance of getting Lyme disease. So here's what the flowers look like. So, you know, even if you can't get it all, if you just like trim it or cut it after it blooms so it can't make more berries and spread further. And then people who have water gardens, this lovely yellow iris, which I planted once upon a time, I didn't know, but this garden overflows in spring floods and it goes down streams. And this is Iris pseudochorus, which I've seen streams in upstate New York that were like 25 miles of nothing but this growing. So not something you want to plant in your garden, especially if your stream has access to natural waterways. So, well, we need to value what we already have. I mean, we live in Connecticut, we have great stuff growing. Whoops. So this is a couple who just decided to let their field grow and see what happened. And they have foxes and wild turkeys and all kinds of things going on. This person noticed that they had a little bit of this native spirea, and it's a suckering plant. And somebody planted the birch trees, and so they wanted a whole thicket of it. Did they go out and buy a whole bunch more plants? No. What they did was they set a mow line around it, knowing that it spread underground. They would mow, say, 18 inches around the shrub until it spread into that 18 inches. And then they'd just mow another 18 inches around the outside, and it would spread in it. And they made this whole thicket simply by adjusting their mowing regime. And when they thought, oh, that's a nice grove, that's about big enough, then they mow up to the edge and it goes no further. Or, anybody have a few rocks in their yard? I have a rock the volume of a one-car garage in my backyard. And so, to dig little holes and plant things that like to grow in rocks, like Christmas ferns. And we can look at the land we have. Here's a person in Sharon, and they had mountain laurel and hay-scented ferns, and you can see a few blackberries, brambles in there, and all they did is take out what they didn't want, and they have this beautiful resonant native landscape. So this is a property where there was garlic mustard, and the whole idea of managing so that you're stacking the deck in favor of the plants you want and looking for the Achilles heel of the plants you don't want. So this is Canada Mayflower here, and hay-scented ferns, and so and there's some Pennsylvania sedge in there. So they noticed that, well, the garlic mustard grows up and it blooms at 18, 20 inches. We have these little low things this high. Garlic mustard is a biennial, so when it starts to flower, when it sends up a bloom stalk, if you just weed whack it down at a height that's over the stuff you want, that's it. It's put its energy into making flowers, and it dies. So that turned out to be a good way to manage a very large property just by weed whacking the garlic mustard, but not the things they wanted. So then they had a chance to take over. This is a friend's place on Cape Cod. This is our Native American holly, Ilex opaca, just self-sowing in her woods. And so when one appeared by her driveway, she let it grow and planted something that's blooming right now, a white wood aster underneath it. And it's so much more interesting than the perfectly pruned little lollipops or pyramids that you buy at the nursery. Okay, goldenrods. This is Solidago cassia. This is blooming right now. It's a very well-mannered clump. It grows in the shade, and it is a total bee magnet. So if you go around and look for this, recognize it. I cut it down after it formed seeds, and I just whacked it around everywhere and slapped trees with it and let the seeds fly. And now I have whole ground cover plantings of it. And we'll see things along the side of the road that are really valuable plants. So here's winterberry holly and the gray dogwood. So these native shrubs we already have. So 5 minutes, okay. Understory tree, our native witch hazel, which is blooming now. And we want to look at putting the layers back in. So we have our native forest is canopy trees, and then that understory tree layer, and an understory shrub layer, and a ground layer.
Is there a spring and fall witch hazel?
Yes, good question. We have spring witch hazels, which are mostly not native ones, although Hamamelis verdus is native a little further south, but this is our native one in our woods that we have now. And so we can edit our woods. So what I find where I live in Kent is You know, the landscape guys come in, they clear out all the brush. Well, all the brush is the stuff that you want. And I think it's well worth looking at your backyard, your front yard, your side yard, and learning what grows there and what's native and what's not native. And if you have people coming into weed whack or cut trees or something, put a price tag on it. Say, you know, you drop a tree on this and here's what you owe me. But they cut down all of the understory trees. And I've had clients, coaching clients say, gee, we used to have woodcocks, but I don't know where they went. And you look at their place and it's like, there's nothing but trees that are like telephone poles and there's nothing on the ground. Well, they have no place to hide and nothing to eat. So of course they left. Okay. So if you're editing woods, you can do it with some sensitivity instead of letting the guys who wouldn't know a dogwood from a palm tree in there with weed whackers identify the plants that you want to keep. So all these little saplings are moosewood, the striped maple, which is a lovely native understory maple tree. Grows in the shade, doesn't get too big, has nutlets that feed birds and berries, and they put a deer fence up and they cut out the invasives and look what appeared. This is what the moosewood looks like. So a good time of year to be looking for these, you know, big bold maple leaves that are kind of canary yellow. Here's what the flowers look like in spring. You know, it's kind of subtle. We all have them in our woods, but we don't even know it. Or spice bush. This is one that the birds planted next to one of my smaller rocks. And not only does the spice bush swallowtail depend on it as a larval food, but the Prometheus moth will make its cocoon in them and overwinter. And it's dioecious, it has males and females. They don't mark that in the nursery, so you have to buy a lot of them. So the females have berries that, guess what, they're red, and boy, do they go fast. And here's what the bark looks like. So that's a way you can identify them even in the winter. Just, it looks like a starry night, just all these little white spots. Okay, I'm going to rush through here. So, because I've been given the 5-minute sign about 4 minutes ago, right? Okay. So, you know, let's take these great plants and put the layers back in instead of lawn and a wall of trees. We get that kind of complexity with plants like Nyssa sylvatica. Lawn under it isn't doing all that much, but how about something like bottlebrush buckeye? So putting the layers back in, which the deer don't eat, and it supports a lot of pollinators, and it grows in the shade. So here's a garden with lots of layers. So lots of ways we can do it. This is redbud, another good understory tree. And our native azaleas, our native mountain laurel, our state flower, oak leaf hydrangeas. So I'm gonna flip through these fast. You have the sheet of things that I recommend. Itea virginica, and there's the redbud in the fall. Here's the Itea in the spring. Fothergilla, one of my favorite native shrubs. It smells like honey. It blooms really early. And here's what the fall foliage looks like. So we have a lot of native shrubs that are just, you know, totally great landscape plants that solve problems and support wildlife and are beautiful. Thank you. As I always say, every yard counts. You know, you don't have to have a huge estate. You can make a huge difference in your own yard. So any questions? More questions? Yes?
I have 3 heartleaf willows, and one of them especially has galls all over the leaves. And so I was told that it's not any cause for concern. So,
Heartleaf willow?
yeah.
I don't know that plant at all. But if you have galls and who told you it was nothing to concern you?
Someone at Earth
Okay, I would trust their advice. Earth Tones Nursery is a native plant nursery in Woodbury, Connecticut, and they sell only native plants, almost exclusively straight species, not cultivars, and they grow almost everything that they sell there by seed that they collect. So they're plants that are really adapted to this area. And a lot of times, galls are in plants, and we have oak leaf galls, and we have goldenrod galls. It means that an insect has laid an egg in there, and it irritates the tissue of the plant, so it swells and forms a gall around it, which protects that insect, which, as I said earlier about the goldenrod gall, the chickadees peck them apart and eat them. So if Earth Tones Nursery said don't worry about it, I would say you're probably supporting valuable insect life. Yes.
Okay, so we had a nice garden this summer. It came late, and now it's really pretty. The flowers are still doing great, but in a week or two, it's going to freeze. Everything's going to die. Am I supposed to clean up now, or am I to leave it?
Great question. My motto is, if it looks bad, cut it off. Otherwise, leave it up and see what happens, because it's not just all about flowers. And so many of those stems are supporting insects. If something's diseased, get it off the property. If it just looks awful and is flopping all over the place, you can tidy it up. But it's very important to do your cleanup in the spring. Or, sloppy snow covers things and knocks things down, and it looks askew and it bothers you. You can neaten up a little, but don't just cut it to the ground, which, I think people used to do, and they're doing less and less. If you have black-eyed Susans and echinaceas, there are seed pods. Astilbes have seed pods that are interesting to look at. Bee balm, I leave my bee balm up all winter, and the stems get kind of stiff and woody, and so they pretty much stand up. But then, they'll get knocked over in the wind, or if something comes, some four-legged critter comes crashing through it and knocking them down. But then you'll see we have a lot of ground-feeding birds. I have a shot of looking out my window at my Monarda that's all knocked over on the ground, and there are juncos all over the place, because some birds eat on the stem and some birds are ground feeders. So even if it's knocked over, just if it really bothers you, it's really lovely to go out on a pretty winter day. It gives you an excuse to go outside and just tinker around in the garden and remember that there's a garden there, and you wind up seeing things that you wouldn't even know you had if you just stayed inside looking out the window. So definitely don't over clean in the fall, and keep as many leaves as you can. I get them off the lawn, but there are overwintering insects in the leaves. I don't want a thick pile of them on top of the crowns of a lot of perennials, and I have voles, so I tend to clean beds out. But then around shrubs, I'll just save as many leaves as I can, pile up the rest, and let them decompose and put it back on the garden next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.